Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. Last year, we were following the YU Max a lot. They had this incredible 50-game winning streak. I don't even like sports. My son actually just got voted to be captain of his basketball team in middle school, so that's pretty exciting. So I am actually following sports a little bit now, but even not liking sports, watching that winning streak was actually pretty exciting. And watching Ryan Turell, sort of the star of this team, was very exciting. And wondering would he be drafted? So he did recently just get drafted to a G League, which my husband explained to me is like minor league in NBA, a possible way to get to actually play in the NBA. And the interesting thing is that we posted first Orthodox Jew to be drafted to the NBA. And the thing that I've noticed doing this job is that if you ever say anything wrong, there is someone on the internet who will thankfully correct you. And so after we wrongly posted that Ryan Turell was the first Orthodox Jew to get drafted to the NBA, someone commented on our post and said that's not actually true. Back in 1981, there's a man named David Kufeld, also a YU alum, who was drafted not to the G League, but to the NBA. And so I, of course, reached out to David to find out about this story that I'd never heard of before because we're so curious to learn more. So, David, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. My honor.
It's interesting because in this advocacy that we're doing for Orthodox Jews, I think we have to try to explain to a lot of people that while there are Jews that have had leadership positions or, been on major, ball teams before, and famous stories of people like Sandy Koufax that sat out and didn't play on Yom Kippur. For the Orthodox community, we're still having a lot of major firsts. We had two, MLB drafts in the last year, which was historic, even though there's been other Jewish, baseball players in the past. Because of our observance, we need institutions, teams, organizations to be willing to accommodate our Shabbos observance, our holidays. Something that's on our mind a lot is that as we're sort of in these times of increased inclusion and equity and diversity, will Jews count in those spaces as well? So if you could just take us back to 1981, I was 1 year old. So that's I was in the world at that point, but I don't remember it very much. So where did you grow up? When did you start playing basketball? I can tell from Zoom you seem to be a pretty tall guy. So tell us about your basketball career before you got to the NBA.
Sure. I was actually drafted in 1980, but 1 year.
Oh, whoops.
We won't quibble.
Okay, 1980.
My first sport was actually baseball.
Okay.
I started our baseball team out in Great Neck, where we had moved to when I was about 8 years old. And a funny story is obviously I was very tall from a young age. You can see pictures of me in kindergarten looking quite tall. And it used to be the procedure for about half an hour before we would start a baseball game, you would have to convince the other coach that I was not a ringer. I was actually 11 years old or 10 years old. So I started there, and I guess in about fifth grade, I started playing basketball, say a little more seriously. Sixth grade, even more so, although I don't think I made the team at North Shore Hebrew Academy when I was in sixth grade, but I did at seventh grade and certainly eighth grade. I was encouraged, particularly by my parents, to pursue sports for a variety of reasons, and they were willing to do the other part of the hard work. The athlete himself or herself obviously has to put in hours, but when you're younger, someone has to take you to practice. Someone has to be there for you, and they certainly did that for me in many ways. And so I was, just for example, I was 6'3" at my bar mitzvah.
Oh, wow.
look at
And
other bar
what's your
mitzvah
what?
kids.
How tall are you? What was your maximum height that you got to?
So I'm 6'8" if I stand
Oh
up
wow.
straight, which sometimes is dangerous depending where I'm standing. Um, so being that tall, certainly playing basketball in a way helped it. I know it's tough for some tall kids who are not basketball players because that's the first thing people will ask them. Wow, you're so tall. It would be a shame that you're not a ball player. But so I spent many hours in the driveway shooting and practicing, and perhaps I should have been hitting the books, but I was hitting shots instead.
And where'd you go to high school?
So I went to MTA, which was little schlep from Great Neck, but I played varsity ball from the time I was a freshman. And it was, as I was saying, I probably didn't appreciate it enough then of how many of the hours my dad, after a long day in the office, to come schlep up to Washington Heights at least twice a week to pick me up. And so I was at MTA, and we had some good teams, not every year, but most of the time. And then I went to YU, which was really, I was intent on playing college basketball, and as we know, it's very difficult to play elsewhere if you're Shomer Shabbat, and obviously there was no conflicts there. But those were the call it the lean years of yeshiva basketball. We had no gym. We had a hard time getting enough players, which you need for practice to scrimmage and all of that. And it was very tough. It was very luckily we had an outstanding coach, knew the game amazingly, and was even a better and is even a better person and advisor who I still feel very close to today. Dr. Jonathan Halpert, Johnny Halpert. But it was just a widely different time than today, when there's an amazing gym and there are fans, and people can follow you. They can watch the games online. We played in what I guess you would call radio silence. You had to make a real effort to come to our games.
And it was Division III at the time as well?
It was Division III. For many years in college basketball, there were just two divisions. The university, as they call it, the major colleges like UCLA, St. John's, and then they called it the college division like YU. And we were still playing, so then they divided that into 1, 2, and 3. When I was a freshman and sophomore, we were still playing a few Division II teams, which was very hard. But so things are different today.
And so if you're playing D3 and the team wasn't like the current YU Max today, how did you, I guess, train to be good enough? How did you get the idea that you might be able to make the NBA draft? If you could take us through what that process looked like.
Sure. I was lucky in that my personal statistics were very high. I led the nation in rebounding for 2 years.
Wow.
Of course, we were missing a lot of our shots, and there were a lot of rebounds to be had. But and I had been developing my reputation. In some ways, I was a late bloomer. I was not as dynamic a high school player in many ways than I was later in my college career. And I guess most kids, however old you are, you dream of the pros, even though that is it seems pretty unattainable. And just to put things in perspective, it was just, no one would in their right mind would even think it was possible. It was just very hard in general for a Division III player to make it to the big leagues. Very few times had that ever happened. But in my situation, this was my only chance, my only time. I had I've had a long career in PR and advertising, and I got started at YU, and they really didn't have a sports PR department. And I started working on publicizing the basketball team and other teams. And for me, I had, because I was already thinking in that way, when I was a senior, I put together what now would be a very crude, very almost embarrassing packet of information that I sent to 10 teams, I recall. Why not? It was my only chance. And I maybe sort of forgot about it, but the NBA draft at that time, unlike today, which is a spectator sport, people actually go to the draft, they buy tickets, they stay there. That year it was not, and it wasn't until the next morning when my father woke me up in the YU dorm, since he read the fine print in the paper the next day that the Portland Trailblazers had drafted me, which was, I mean, there's one thing at YU, there are a lot of obviously pre-med students and pre-law, and people celebrate getting into med school or law school, and that's an expected thing. But this was just something no one could even consider or even conceive of. So,
but can I interrupt you for a second? So you didn't meet them; they simply drafted you after looking at a packet that you sent them. Is that how? Because aren't there? I mean, I don't really know anything about this, but don't they like watch people? Don't they scout and watch them play? Are there always some people that they just take sight unseen based on their stats?
Sure. Well, back then they were 10 rounds, so they took 10 players.
Okay.
Before the days of YouTube, you didn't really have so much video. So for pro teams, the top few rounds, the top few picks, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, they would put effort into scouting, and they knew who they wanted, and so they had 10 rounds. So I was the 10th round pick, which a team could take a gamble on that. Portland Trailblazers, actually, I wasn't the only Division III player they took that year. They took another player, Mike Harper, who was at that time the best player of all time in Division III, and he actually made the team. A 6'10" guy from a small school in Illinois. The backstory, which I didn't really even know right away, the president of the team, a guy named Harry Glickman, was involved in the Maccabees basketball, and so he had a good Jewish heart, and I think he had followed some of my career, which was not easy to follow, but he did know a bit about me. And the even more incredible situation was the owner of the team, Larry Weinberg, may rest in peace. He was a Yeshiva Flatbush graduate and wanted to draft a Jewish player. And it was my fortune that Danny Shays, the son of Dolph Shays, one of the NBA's all-time greats, Danny was just a junior that year. So he wasn't up for being drafted. And they selected me, and it was, I didn't really find that out until like a year or two later. Larry was one of the founders of AIPAC, and my mother, may she rest in peace, met him at a Zionist meeting, Council of Presidents, and so we found out later on, and turns out my grandfather was his principal, and at Flatbush. So, and he didn't
Hmm.
put two and two together. So it's just nice how sometimes things come full circle.
So if these people, especially one was a Flatbush grad, the other one was Jewish, did they realize that you were going to have an issue with playing on Shabbos when they drafted you?
Um, I don't think so. You know, I had honestly a fair chance to make the team like any other guy there. They invited, so what's different now is that then they had what's called a rookie camp. They invited the 10 picks to come, and they invited uh, some veteran players who they were considering signing. So there were 20 guys from schools like UCLA, Ohio State, Michigan, um, and I mean, the ball was in my court, so to speak, to make something of that. I don't know really. I mean, obviously, it was not something I was asking them. I knew that my chances were so remote, but the fact that they enabled me to go out there like everyone else was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. It started on a Sunday. I knew that odds are I would be released during the week. Just knowing at that point I had already played on some higher levels over the summer. I knew I was out of well, sort of academic, but I was out of position even at 6'8". I played center, and in the NBA that's short, and so to change positions was tough. But my goal all the while was to play in Israel that next year, and they gave me this amazing opportunity, this gift, and I took it. I mean, it was in retrospect maybe a little bit risky, because what if I somehow did? I mean, things happen, crazy things happen, and for me, the immediate conflict would have been the players who made it through the whole week. On Friday night, they were going to play against the real team in front of 20,000 fans at the Portland Coliseum. And luckily, it didn't come to that. But I'd like to think that I would have bowed out, although that would have been very awkward for sure. I mean, it was a real calculated risk. My mother was only convinced that, well, I made the other teams I've tried out for. Why wouldn't I make this team? And she was worried sick about it. So that did not come to pass.
Can I ask you a question? Because as we've established, I don't know so much about sports. Does it always go this process that they draft you and then you have a trial in person, or sometimes they just draft you and you're on the team? Because I thought it was the latter and not the former. Like, what's the normal mechanism for drafting someone for the NBA?
Sure. Well, now there are only 2 rounds, so
Oh,
huge pressure for each of these picks to be a sure thing. And players try out before the draft, where the teams already know who they want to pick. They've seen them in college, and then they've seen them since college in almost like a job interview where they're playing for them. The money has gotten obviously so crazy, so large that they can't really risk anything. They certainly can invite a player who they're not so sure about. They can invite them to play on a summer league team or to try out with them. So there's just no comparison. It's so much harder now to get drafted. It's almost it's statistically impossible even for players from the top level. There are just only so many spots, and the NBA is full of foreign players now because foreign players are better, and the NBA wants to promote the league overseas. So there are a lot of forces that make it very, very tough. I mean, this is
so
sorry.
sorry. Continue.
yeah, I was going to say that realistically, you have to, uh, if you really are thinking of NBA, you can't go to MTA, you can't be going to YU. You have to start and at a very young age, and that's what a lot of these players do, especially when you can get drafted right out of high school. So there are very few secrets, very few unknown players, even for high school players.
Now you did after you so you did get cut from that draft. Now I'm understanding this story better. You went on to play elsewhere. Where to tell us about your ball career after that?
Sure, I again it was my goal to play here to play in Israel. Um, uh, there had been there still is the teams in Israel are usually sponsored by different organizations, Maccabees, Hapoel, and they have different teams in different cities. And there is a group called Elitzur, which was I guess an outgrowth of the National Religious Party. A lot of these are politically rooted, and I figured I would have no trouble playing for them in terms of Shabbat. What happened was in my year that I went, the Israeli teams, and this was again 1980, a long time ago, they were hiring so many foreign players that the Sabras, the Israeli players, were not getting enough playing time. So the way it works in European and Israeli sports, it's not like college and pro. You have the top level, and then there's the B level, the C level, and the teams that finished let's say the bottom two spots at the top level move down in the next season to the lower level. So there's always pressure to stay at the top level. So that year they froze the standings. So teams were not hiring foreign players as much. So Elitzur decided they were not going to really put as much money in their budget. The team I signed with, Maccabi Ramat Gan, they actually enabled me, strangely enough, to play as the designated foreigner, which in again, European leagues, if you're a citizen of the country, it's easier for you to get a job on those teams. They usually have 1 or 2 spots for a non-citizen. And in Israel, whenever there's a Jewish player, generally from the States, they become olim, and they don't have to use that spot to, they can hire a non-Jewish player, for example. So I played as the designated foreigner or Gentile, which was certainly. I mean, I had prepared to become an oleh at that time. I felt doing it for basketball wasn't really, the ideal scenario, and I didn't know much about benefits, and certainly I would use them up before I really had a chance to do that. But I didn't have to worry about it.
You got to play the non-Jew. Sort of circling back now to today, where we are with having some drafts now in MLB, G League, NBA, an Olympic hopeful with BD Deutsch. What are your thoughts? And we have about 5 minutes to go. What are your thoughts about the world of sports accommodating religious players from any religious faith?
Right, and that is a factor. Certainly, Muslim athletes have had to compete during Ramadan. They've had to fast, and if they're observant. So it's an interesting thing. It's not a level playing field, to use an athletic word. Sports, it's all about how good you are. How certainly, depending on it might be, if you're in a team sport, there are other things you can't control. So there is a meritocracy, but at the same token, one's observance, one's religious observance should not preclude you from being given a chance to succeed or fail. But at some point, either you have the goods or you don't. And so it's a little bit different than, let's say, lawyers, accountants, or whatever profession. When you're dealing with talent, whether you're a singer, an actor, it's certainly complicated. I believe that hard choices have to be made by the athlete, him or herself, as to how far they will go, how they will try to bend the rules if they have to. But that's a very personal thing and harder to do when you're in the spotlight and if you're a role model. Those are not easy. Those are not easy questions, and I've seen that in various scenarios. When I was at YU, I was in the drama club. Of course, I couldn't get many roles because I was a foot taller than the rest of the cast usually. So there are only so many monsters that they could have in a play. We had amazing actors, and what are they supposed to do? It's very tough, but. Luckily in Israel, it's still not even in Israel, it's not without some complications. If you're a soccer player, games are generally on Shabbat. I was lucky that in basketball, when I played in Israel, the games used to be, the league games were Friday nights until the year before I started, where they moved to Sunday nights. So I was lucky.
Wow, so not even in Israel. Yeah, I hear the complex nature of it, and obviously the person has to have the talent and the will to practice as much as it takes to be able to compete. But the question is, if the talent and the will is there in this age of continuing inclusion and trying to find ways to create diverse spaces. Can there be room for religious accommodation as well? So that's a conversation we're going to keep on having and keep on hopefully bringing to places like different sports organizations. We're doing that now in Hollywood, but just want to thank you for being a trailblazer in this space. And now we'll know that David Kufeld in 1980 was the first Orthodox Jew drafted to the NBA. So thanks so much for your work for our community.
Thank you. And thank you for all you're doing as well.
Thanks so much. And you can catch us same time, same place next week. Bye-bye.